This is the March 16th, 2022 meeting of the Finance Subcommittee of the Brookline School Committee. We're going to get cranking in the agenda so that we can get through things in a timely fashion. So the first thing on the agenda, if I pull it up, is approval of the minutes from February 23rd and March 2nd, 2022. I'm going to move those. Can I get a second? Thank you, Susan. Stephen, how do you vote?
Yes.
Susan?
Yes.
And I vote yes. Great. Next item up on the agenda is approval of or acceptance of gifts and grants. There's 3 gifts to support. The first to support the African American and Latino Scholars Program. The second one and the third one are in support of Brookline Adult and Community Education's raffle. And that's great. All of that, wonderful. And then the next for the grants, there are 3 grants for one from DESE, one from BU, and one from DESE, a third one from DESE. I'm going to make a motion to accept the grants and gifts. Can I get a second? Thank you, Susan. Sam, I just have a quick question on them. Sorry, I'm like catching you while you're probably eating a snack.
No worries. No worries. No worries.
Were these grants ones that were already in the sort of knowledge of what you were receiving, or are they above and beyond what we knew about? Quick, easy question, I think.
I would say in the knowledge of what we knew we would be receiving.
Okay, thanks. Stephen, how do you vote?
Yes.
Susan?
Yes.
And I vote yes as well. Okay, so now we're going to turn to the next item on the agenda, which is an enrollment update. And I'm going to turn it over to Erin.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Yes. Perfect. So thanks for having me here this afternoon. Just to be totally transparent, I have a pretty hard stop at 4:45, so I will be talking a little bit quickly through these slides in the hopes that I can be able to answer questions at the end. But if I am talking too fast or you're not sure of something that I'm explaining, please feel free to interrupt me. My screen is showing my presentation, so you might need to actually speak out loud instead of raising your hand so that I can hear or see you if you need me to stop midway. So our agenda for this afternoon, I will review our SIMS enrollment over time. So just a reminder, SIMS is our student information management system. This is how we transmit our enrollment data to the Department of Education 3 times a year, each school year. I will outline our current and next year kindergarten registrations to date. So you'll see a little bit of historical information as well as current registration information. And then I will talk through 2 different types of enrollment projections or forecasts that we have for the upcoming or next school year. Moving right along, you should be a little bit familiar with this chart. Megan and I presented a version of this in November. So what this shows you is our enrollment across reporting periods over time. That's pre-K, so BEEP through 12. And actually, when I say 12 during this presentation, think about our special population students as well. Normally, that's a number between 19 and 25 every year. The blue bar represents our June enrollment, and the orange bar represents our October enrollment. So what I wanted to highlight here is end of the year enrollment compared to beginning of the year enrollment. And in the middle there, you'll see that dip in enrollment, which we've been talking about. That's the beginning of that pandemic school year in October 2020. That decrease in enrollment shows up there between the end of the year in June and the beginning of the year in October. What we see on the far right is a slight increase in coming back to our pre-pandemic enrollment. Obviously, we still have some ways to go. Our March numbers are 7,013. Again, that's beep through our special program population. These are really preliminary. We are still working with our programs in particular to make sure we have these numbers correct. The numbers are due at the end of March, but based on our preliminary analysis, we will be around that 7,013 number. So we're seeing a slight uptick from last June. And then another slight uptick from October. So looking at some historical and current kindergarten registration information, what I have for you here are the number of students registered by March 1st each year, and then the number of students that actually enroll by October, a handful of months later. We always open our kindergarten registration sometime around the beginning of January. So you'll see from 2018-19 through our current year, 22-23, how many students were enrolled during that January to March time period. In the column next to that, you see the number of students who were enrolled that we reported on October 1st. So for example, in school year 18-19, we had 291 students registered by March 1st, and we had 603 students enrolled by October 1st. So that was about 48% of our enrolled population registered by March. As we look through to the 21-22 school year, we're closer to 50%. We did have some upticks in 19-20 and 20-21, around that 64 to 68%. And then our enrollments this year are currently at 314. So again, that's from January through March 1st, 314 kindergarten students registered for next year. We believe we'll be somewhere around like the 50 to 55, 60 average in terms of percent enrolled. If you're looking at those four numbers there, the average of those percentages are 58 down those 4 years. So I think we'll be close to that in terms of the number of students. We've done a lot of work in our Office of Registration and Enrollment around updated and I would say early and often outreach, and then updated materials. We've also had some change in staffing, which allows for 0.5 additional staffing for our ORE office. You all know we transitioned Mike into full-time communications, and then that left someone open for full-time registration and enrollment. And then we have some specialized information sessions and outreach for our BEEP families. So those are BEEP 4 families, students that will be able to transition into kindergarten next year. So they get some additional opportunities. All right, so moving on to our two different types of projection or forecast methodology. The first one I'm going to call a single point projection methodology. This is something that you're probably most familiar with in some of our historical enrollment projections. We use this cohort survival model using a 5-year average of progression rates. What I did for this particular year was take out the progression rate for the 2020-21 school year. If you remember from a couple of slides ago, that's the school year where we lost those 800 or so students. That really impacts the progression. Obviously, the progression rates for that year are much lower, and then that really impacts the average. So I ended up taking out that particular year. So our 5-year rates, you'll see it on the next slide, which years those include. I also include new housing developments that will be occupied during this FY23 school year as indicated by our town planning department. So you can see those 3 different developments there on the slide. That's 134 Babcock, 21 Crown and Shield, and then Hancock Village. There's actually 2 developments within Hancock Village that incorporate those 101 students, and we use those same student generation ratios to make projections as to how many students would come from those particular buildings. And then finally, this single point projection assumes a BEEP enrollment at 300 students. So that's a little bit higher than our October 1 number, but actually really close to where we are right now in terms of BEEP enrollment. I think we're actually over that by 1 or 2 students. And then also assumes our special program enrollment as 24 students, which is what we reported on October 1st. So here are the years that I use in our progression range or a progression average, 16, 17, 17, 18, 18, 19, 19, 20. We skip that 20, 21 year and then include the 21, 22 year. So this is all based on our October 1 enrollment. Each year, again, I exclude that 2021 year. When I include that in the average, it actually drops our average to a projection that's lower than our current enrollment numbers. And we just don't really think that, again, we want to take out that outlier year and make sure we are including progressions that fit the historical pattern and the historical trend of the district. And you'll see that number to the far right, the system total of 1.0, essentially that's a 1-to-1 average. So students that are enrolled 1 year enroll in the next school year. Obviously that's different by grade level. We tend to see an over 1.0 in the high school, for example, and some closer to, 0.9798 in the elementary, some of the earlier elementary grades, but on average, we're at that 1-to-1 ratio. So when I put that 5-year progression into the model, on the table on the left there shows you what those numbers come out to be. Again, the pre-K number 300, and then you can see how it impacts the different grade spans or different grade levels moving forward, which leads us to an overall enrollment projection, the single point projection of 7,016. That is just for a frame of reference, 90% of our pre-pandemic enrollment. So in the 1920 school year, our October 1 numbers were 7,777. I don't think I will ever forget that. So 90% of our pre-pandemic enrollment. But as you know, we're all still living and coming off this global pandemic. And I've said it throughout the entire year, even last year, enrollment does remain volatile. We have international student travel that we need to take into consideration. There's some programs that are deferring acceptance for medical and academic positions that some of our families normally partake in. We have, financial constraints that families are considering. Housing costs are increasing as our interest rates. Students might be making different choices for high school enrollment. And obviously, more recently, our current political environment might play or might have an impact on these numbers. So given all of this, we're also providing you with what I'm going to call an enrollment range forecast, which creates an enrollment range using prior year forecasts and historical data. You might remember this from last budget season. We called it a cone of uncertainty. It essentially provides you that range of potential enrollment given the circumstances that I just mentioned on the previous slide. So I will provide you with 3 different ranges. The low range will be that single point projection that I just explained. So 7,016 students. The high range is going to be the Cropper-McGibbon forecast. And when you get this in PDF mode, that's linkable. So you can click on it and see that report. And then the mid-range, which I'll talk a little bit more about, is going to be an average of 3 different enrollment indicators that we feel will help us make decisions around students who may have left and might be coming back to Brookline. And again, this method just allows us to plan for a best guess while also remaining sufficiently staffed to respond to a larger number of students if they do end up coming. I'll bring you back probably a full year ago. This might look familiar to you. This was the method that was used in FY22 during the budget cycle. Similar idea being the low range is at that 6,502 at the bottom right-hand corner. The high range again is that Cropper-McGibbon forecast at 7,665. What I've added here is what our actual enrollment was for FY22. So October 1, we were at 6,650 students for K through 12. Now these numbers do look a little bit different because this is K through 12 in particular. And I have been talking to you about BEEP or pre-K through our special program population. So that's why they're a little bit off. But you can see that using this method last year, again, allowed us that range and a range of enrollment to think through and to plan for. And we did end up near that lower end of the range, but we are, as shown in previous slides, higher than that in our current enrollment. So we do anticipate some slight increases moving forward. Let's talk through this mid-range enrollment number for a second. Again, I wanted to take a couple of different indicators that might help us think about how many students may return, given some of the information that we collect in the district. So the first one being the number of immigrant students withdrawals. So students that transferred out of state from June 2020. So that was, a couple months after the pandemic started, and October 2020, which was the beginning of that pandemic school year. So we had 262 immigrant or newcomer. So that's students that are within their first 3 years of schooling in the United States. 262 of them transferred out of state. We don't actually know whether that out of state is to Vermont or to Brazil. It just means they left Massachusetts. But given their immigrant status in our system and in the state system, we're going to use that number as a proxy. The second and middle number there is the percent of our EL students has decreased 2% from fall 2019 to fall of this year. So in 2019, the percent of our PSB population that was EL was 11%, and it is currently, or in October 2021, was 9%. So that's a 2% decrease, and that's a decrease of 155 students. So that's another number that we're taking into consideration. And then the third number far right is who's coming back. So what does it look like for our immigrant or our newcomer students registration? You'll see there that we have 245 students listed as newcomers or immigrants that have registered between January 1 of last year and March 1 of this year. So 245 students have come back to us in about a year. Now, I say come back to us, it doesn't mean the same student left and re-enrolled. We're just taking these as, number of students that left, number of students that are coming back. And so what I did for you was average those three numbers. So 262, 155, 245, and that average comes out to 221. And so that is the number that I'm going to add to that low projection or that single point projection number to get us our mid-range number. So as we move to this slide on the far right-hand side, you can start to see similar to the FY22 chart, that cone or that range of potential enrollment. So the high range, again, is that Cropper-McGibbon number, 7,961 students. That's 102% of our pre-pandemic enrollment. Do we think we're going to be there in 2023? Probably not. But that's the number that they, projected for us a couple of years ago. And it was also the number that we used last year for our high range. The mid range, so that's adding that 221 students to the 7,016, comes to 7,237 students, and that's 93% of our pre-pandemic enrollment. And then that low range, like I talked about earlier, is that single point range, 7,016, and that is 90% of our pre-pandemic enrollment. All right, so what does this mean when we break down students by grade span and by our sections? So this is a historical and forecasted look at what our section number, what our enrollment in different grade spans and then our K-8 sections could look like. If we start on the far left, 1920, I'm going to move you all the way down to the K-8 sections row. We had 270 sections across our K-8 schools. We had the same in school year 2021. And then this year we've decreased that number to 258 sections. The number below that in the row is going to be our average class size. So you can see we've also from 1920 to 2021 decrease our class size. As we move into the yellow shaded columns, those are the low, mid, and high forecasts that I just talked about on the previous slide, and how those enrollment numbers break down by grade span. If we decrease another 12 sections across those forecasts, we get a average class size somewhere between 18 and a half to, let's say, just 20 and a half. So we're increasing our class size, decreasing our sections as we, regardless of what range, I guess, of enrollment we land in the fall. And this is really on trend with what we've seen historically in terms of our class sizes. No, this is a little bit hard to see, but this is an older chart that outlines in green the average. I would just look at the green bars, actually. That's 2002 through 2018. Those are our class sizes with special education students included. The bar underneath separates out general ed students. So I would just look at the green bar. And that the high range there is 21 or so, 21.14, and the low range there is somewhere just over 19. So again, as we think about our range of potential enrollments and going back to our potential average class sizes, we're pretty much in line with where we have been historically. And then finally, this slide is going to talk through our enrollment ranges versus our building capacity. The enrollment ranges are on the left-hand side there. And this is an image that was adapted from an analysis that Dave Gayshock, Nathan Spritz, and Mike Toffel did in 2020. And this essentially shows in the bar, in the kind of blue lines where enrollment could be in those projected years. And then the green star is going to be our high range, the mid, or the yellow star is going to be our mid range, and then the red star is going to be our low projected range for K-8, and how that might impact our building capacity. I don't know, Mariah, if you want to say anything else about this slide in particular.
No, I think you captured it accurately. The blue sort of darker dashed line was the Cropper-McGibbon forecast, and that's why you'll see that green star is directly on it. And then the purple dotted line is the MSBA forecast that they provided during the Pierce process. And as you said, we have the updated blue line, that's the enrollment, and then you can compare sort of where we're at. And over on the left, there's a note, there may be some opportunities. We're still exploring what's going on with the enrollment, but depending on where enrollment stabilizes, assuming it does stabilize somewhere, then there may be opportunities to consider, for example, bringing BEEP back into some of the buildings from lease space. Again, this is very preliminary, and we'll know more over the next year and time to come.
So I'm going to stop sharing. I can certainly pull anything up, but it's just easier for me to see if people have hands raised.
Erin, you've stunned them into silence.
Like I have a hard stop at 4:45. I'm going to race through this so I can answer questions.
Go for it, Stephen.
So that was awesome. Thank you, Erin. That was so thorough. I just have the really obvious question of where do you fall in the range of predictions? How do you think through about which of them to look at when we're doing our planning?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I do think what we did with some of those additional indicators really makes sense, especially the last one there where we're looking at the number of students who are coming back. That 245 number, I think it is. Yeah. Megan and her team do a phenomenal job documenting all of this information, especially recently where we've asked her to capture even more info. So she was able to pull that for me pretty quickly today. I think the more that we continue to look at those numbers, the better off we will be at, I say, predicting or projecting or forecasting. I still think it's really challenging. I mean, a lot of the data directors that I've talked to, actually met with a handful of them this morning, are having these same challenges around how to predict or forecast what enrollment might look like, especially when we had such large decreases across the state. And
Are
so
there
I
any
do.
comparable shocks? Is there anything that we can compare COVID to when it comes to when it comes to public school enrollment?
Say more about your question.
Are there any guideposts whatsoever when thinking about how external shocks can impact the resilience of a public school population?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I haven't looked at it enough to be able to answer that question, thoroughly, but most people that I talk to, especially in our population, when we have such a churn and such an international community, I think it's just really challenging. Even when I spoke briefly with Jerome McGibbon, or Dr. McGibbon, who some of you might remember, he tends to think it's not even, I don't want to say not worth projecting, but it's just, again, really difficult to be able to do that with any sort of certainty. So I think as long as we keep looking at the numbers that Megan and her team collect, thinking about using our current enrollment or even that single point enrollment as our low number, and then moving from there, I think that's probably the smartest thing to do, is just to keep getting information and making decisions based on that.
Thanks,
And
Aaron.
adding to that, Stephen, I think what we've been talking about in the Superintendent's Association is that Massachusetts has lost the equivalent of essentially, I think it's Worcester, that's about 30,000 kids across the state. So across the Commonwealth, that's how many students have. That's the experience enrollment dip that we saw across the state as a result of COVID. Now, what that pertains to nationally, I haven't looked at those numbers, but that's sort of the stat that we have right now.
Yeah, I also think we talked about this a little bit when I presented, or Megan and I presented on enrollment to the full school committee, looking at the number of students that we've had transfer, not only out of state, but we know the number of kids who transfer to different in-state private schools. And that number is fairly high for us, at least in the last year. So thinking a little bit about that too, and maybe doing some sort of surveying of the community as to why those decisions were made and whether or not they're thinking about coming back to our public schools, or what would have them make them come back, I think is something that we should think about as well.
David and then Cliff.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for this presentation. And this was touched upon briefly, but I'm wondering to what extent these enrollment projections will impact the district's thinking around long-term strategic planning for leases, particularly as pertains to the B program.
I'm not sure we want to talk about, we don't want to ask Aaron. I'm going to say, Aaron, do you want to talk about that, or do you want to defer that to another place and time?
I was just going to say I would defer that to either Sam or Linus on the call.
I'll go as far as saying this, Cliff. Certainly there's been a lot of discussion about what options we hold, on the leases for the spaces we do lease. What does the Pierce project have for impact on those leases, as well as, there are a lot of moving parts. To your point, Driscoll's capacity coming online, as well as other properties that the town owns, namely Baldwin and Newberry. And so, we're looking at all that, but it's fluid. It has an impact. I guess the answer is yes. The enrollment impacts.
David, do you have your hand still up for another question, or is that your only question?
No, that was my only question.
Thanks. Cliff?
Mariah. Thanks for the presentation. It was very, very helpful. I do have a few questions. The first one is whether or not we can get a copy of the presentation, for the subcommittee, and frankly, it's the type of information that is going to be worth circulating earlier rather than later to full advisory, just because this is going to be a question that people will certainly be asking. I guess I had two other questions that are kind of related with regard to the forecast. The first is on these single points that you talked about with respect to international students and ELL students kind of coming in, going out. I'm curious to know if there's any overlap between some of those populations, because I would think that the ELL students would be, at least some of them, included in the international students. And to the extent there's overlap, is there any way to correct for that so that we're not double counting? That's question one. I'll ask the second question since they're all related. The second question really is the utility of including the Cropper-McGibbon number. And I asked that because I guess my understanding was that Cropper-McGibbon more or less has said that, the numbers that they did are really not relevant anymore. And so I think that we're creating a really false narrative when the folks who prepared the report for us have stated that their work no longer has any validity. It's not to say that we shouldn't go back to them, because I think we probably should as soon as it makes sense. But I think including that number and showing it out to the public, says something that we know the authors would not stand behind.
Thanks, Cliff. Let me answer these, I think, in order. So first, yes, you definitely, and the public can definitely get this presentation. I will make sure that Robin gets it so she can post it for everybody.
Can I make one comment too, which is
Sure.
a lot of this, Cliff, is going to come back to the subcommittee tomorrow. So there'll be another chance to discuss it again for anyone who missed this.
I assumed.
Yep.
Your second question was around the overlap of those populations. And that's a great question. I would say, I know when I looked at our students who have withdrawn, I actually looked at their immigration status as well as their EL status, and there are some overlap there. So it might be worth, as you say, thinking whether or not we're double counting some of those as we're making that mid-range projection. So I can certainly look at that. The third is something that we definitely talked about, whether or not to use the Cropper number in that high range. It's a number that we used last year as well. And so I wanted to keep it consistent, and I wanted to utilize the historical information that we do have. But I think your point is well taken.
Can I just make one comment on Cropper? I don't think that anyone is saying that we should rely on that number as the single forecast number, but I think as sort of this is the best high end number we have right now. Certainly we wouldn't make that like our plan, but I do think it helps again in this cone of uncertainty. That was one model, wouldn't be the only one we're relying on, but it informs the overall sort of perspective of where this might be going.
Mm-hmm.
Susan, go ahead. Unless, assuming you're all set, Cliff, and you don't have any other.
Yeah, I'll save other comments for tomorrow.
Thanks. Okay, Susan, go ahead.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks for this, Erin. I know it's a lot of work to always put together. It always looks simple at the end, but there's a ton of work that goes into it. So thank you for this. Two questions. One is just make sure I understand question. I'm not sure I did. There was on the slide, I don't remember what number it was, but the slide that was based on the work that like Dave, Nathan, and Mike did, where it showed that we were expanding Runkle and Heath, we're expanding Ruff and Ridley, we're expanding Driscoll. It looked like we were expanding Pierce on that slide. Maybe we can pull it back up.
Yep.
But it's my understanding that the way we were using peers, we were not expanding peers. So I think part of what we've historically had a trouble with communicating is because for a long time we were over enrolling our schools based on what they were built for, it makes it look like we are increasing like capacity with the Pierce at a 4, which it's my understanding that we're sort of not, because Pierce was sort of 4.5 and it's kind of going to 4, but I might be misunderstanding.
I think Pierce was built as a 3, Susan. And
It
so what you
was.
see there, that step refers from going from 3 to a 4.
It was, but that step of going, that the base, the gray, you're right. Pierce was built as a quote unquote built as a 3, but given all the expansions that we had, I think what's a little bit confusing is that it looks like Pierce is going to be adding capacity system wide, which it isn't. We're going to be reducing Pierce enrollment. Does that make sense? You're absolutely right, Mariah, but that's actually not how we populated Pierce. So I'm just trying to figure out what the right way. I'm going to leave it as a question. I don't need an answer right now, but I just want to flag that as something that might confuse people about increasing capacity. The second question was, given that as the superintendent said, so many other districts are going through similar things. I think what I found enormously helpful about the decline in enrollment analysis that you guys did a while back was sort of where they went. And because I think different things are going to bring people back from different places. So unless we believe there's a long-term structural, I mean, these kids didn't disappear, right? They went somewhere. So some of them went back to a country that they weren't, that's not the United States. Some went to private school. Some kids were redshirted. Like there are different things happening. And so, not for next year, because I think we're not getting them back in 1 year, but I think it would be helpful just sort of it's probably a regional question. It might be a national question. It's probably a regional question as we talk to the other superintendents in and around Boston, as we talk to Cropper McGibbon, as we talk to, whomever, what is it that we think is going to happen with those groups of kids who are left? Because it is a lot, but they fall into you can segment them. And I think it would be helpful for us to know if, generally speaking, the experts and the superintendents in our area, if we have reason to believe that some of those kids are going to be coming back and some just aren't, right? That would be really good to know. Not for us specifically, but just conceptually speaking, what our take is. And I think my third question is, I think it's a pretty specific question. When we talk about the cohort survival methodology, which I think was way back in the beginning, we've had debates over time as to whether or not to add new housing developments on top of, for example, the Cropper McGibbon, or whether the Cropper McGibbon numbers sort of include that. And so you shouldn't add it on top. So for example, when we talk about adding Hancock Village in, is that already kind of, we just need to it'd be helpful to just sort of clarify if that's already kind of baked into any one of these scenarios, or if we're adding it on, if that makes sense. Because I think there was at least one earlier iteration of enrollment methodology when we had an enrollment methodology and then we had all these new developments and we added those on, but there was a little bit of double counting because the original methodology actually included a factor for new growth. It wasn't quite as big as we were having in Brookline, but it did include a factor of new growth. So we had to kind of pull that back. So anyway, I just want to put that out there as a methodology question, because people may ask whether that's a number we should be adding in or whether that's a number that's baked in. Sorry, there was one other thing, which is more of a narrative question. I think I assume I've already gotten questions about whether or not students who are in the projections are for class sizes, sort of the why didn't we, if we lost if we added 1,000 students, we would need to add a whole bunch of teachers. But if we lost 1,000 students, why didn't we lose a whole bunch of teachers? And so I think just a simple, we've talked about this a number of times, but just that simple 3 to 4 sentence explanation of that is probably worthwhile to have ready, especially when we're looking at the slide of the class sizes, so that people understand what was happening. So if we can add that into the narrative, we've talked about it so many times, but as this goes out into the world, we haven't really it's not sort of baked in here. But anyway, all of these are kind of around the margins, but this is just really good overall. I'm just trying to anticipate questions we're going to get. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I can answer a couple of them. So since I have been in Brookline, so just over 5.5 years, prior to Cropper, I guess, coming and doing the forecast, we would do our projections, one without including new housing developments, and then one including new housing. And then we would sort of compare and I believe make a decision as to which one we would use for our planning purposes. The way that I did the single point projection this year, which gets us to our 7,016 number, is I did add those students in after the progression rate. And I did that because those students aren't, I'm making an assumption that those students aren't here yet, and that student generation ratio is going to bring those kids, that 117 students or something like that, to the district, but we can certainly talk about it. And I think maybe it was your second question around what will happen to groups of students who left. Part of, I think, how I answered one of Stephen's questions, I think, potentially gets at that too. What are families choosing? And will they come back? But in my little data director group, we can have that conversation too. And I'm sure Linus has the same with his superintendent colleagues.
Erin, I'm looking at the time and want to make sure we get you out on
Thank
time.
you.
So why don't we let you go? I don't see anyone else's hands up. And if there's any other discussion on this, we can field it with people who are here.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Sorry.
Thank you.
Rush out. Appreciate it.
Any other comments or questions, or anyone this is a subcommittee meeting, anyone in the attendees who would like to raise their hands and comment, you're also welcome to. Okay. Next up on the agenda after personnel is the review, or after enrollment, I'm sorry, is the review of the personnel budget. I'm going to pull up quickly the spreadsheet, the final version of the spreadsheet that we all had looked at 2 weeks ago, and go through this quickly, but only insofar as to provide a little bit of the backdrop, and then I will turn it over to Linus to discuss personnel in more detail. So I'm going to pull this up. You all got this in your email as well. It is small, so I'm going to see if I can make it bigger. But this is again the FY22 and FY23. There was a hope to be able to go further back in time, but the data isn't as crisp as we would like, and so we're not going to try and backfill the data at this point. But we can do this going forwards. Several of the requests that were made, and I'm not going to remember them all off the top of my head right now, but for example, Andy had requested that paraprofessionals be pulled out, and so you'll see that in spots in the spreadsheet, those numbers are now pulled out. I'm trying to remember, there were some other areas, for example, student services. There was a request to disambiguate some of the programs within student services, so those are now teased out as well. And I apologize that I can't remember off the top of my head the rest of the comments that were made, and I don't have my notebook right here to refer to. For example, admin staff in buildings, principals and vice principals and deans have now been separated out from front office staff. And so I'm really grateful to the staff for pulling this together. I think it is a really helpful way to get a bird's eye view of what's going on in different trends in the different groups. And unless people have specific questions, we don't necessarily have to discuss it in detail. But I'm going to throw it open I'm going to stop sharing, but throw open the conversation for anyone who wants to ask specific questions or make comments before we turn it over to Linus for the next part of the presentation.
Mariah, just a quick question. How many out of district placements do we have?
80.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. Any other questions or comments on that? Okay, I'm going to say thanks again to Sam and to Renan and to the team for putting that together, and excited to have that as a template going forward for how we look at staffing. Okay, Linus, you are up.
I'm up. So you should be seeing, oh, that's the wrong button. You should be seeing FY23 preliminary budget, school subcommittee. I see a nod. So this is the operating budget at a glance, as was previously shared, where we were in FY23, with the blue lines being our what ended up being our appropriations from the town. And then the lighter blue here, the 130.6 million being the preliminary budget request. So that's the information as was previously shared or communicated out to the community at large. Where we are, what we're thinking about in terms of, I thought I arranged this differently, but I'll get to it. In terms of looking at how we gain what were referred to as efficiencies, we certainly want to, again, think about pandemic, endemic, continued impact that COVID has had on our community, and what does recovery continue to mean for us. We've just talked through the what's referred to now as the cone of uncertainty around enrollment, and then making sure that we are still committing to our delivering education that's aligned to our core values. And so in looking at PSB staffing levels, our K2 guidelines of no more than 22 students in those sections, and then 3 through 8, no more than 25, may exceed there. Prior to our enrollment boom, the average class sizes were about 19, and more recently, some classes have gotten up to 21. And what we're looking at in terms of the staffing or the enrollment goals, or the average that's here in 22, is an average class size of 19 students. And when we looked at our actuals back in October, we were sitting at 18. So thinking about FY23, in order to gain some staffing efficiencies, what does that look and feel like? It's thinking about bumping those class sizes up slightly larger, not making huge shifts, but again, being able to gain some efficiencies in terms of student to teacher ratios, increasing that up slightly in the K-8 sector. If we roll back the clock a little bit, on February 10th, I believe, the school committee voted to acknowledge the preliminary budget of $130,619,874, and the town allocation at $124,817,362. The action was that the school committee will continue working with the superintendent, select board, and town administrator to align numbers through identification of additional revenues and efficiencies. And so tonight we want to talk with you through some of the efficiencies. So as we identify and realize cost efficiencies, some of the staffing refinements that we're working towards and working through, and we'll share a little bit with you tonight, is looking at section adjustments, building leader, again, thinking through the master scheduling process, refining FTE assignments, making sure that there's alignment between the role and the need. We shared with you also, I think previously, launching position control, where we actually can run our numbers much more efficiently to understand how much and how many we have in the census system. Certainly assessing and constantly monitoring our retirement and resignation notices, as well as reviewing our current vacancies, as well as running those through an approval process for filling. things that that we are considering right now, and this isn't the exhaustive list, but we recognize that the enrollment dip that PSB experienced had its greatest impact at the K-8 level. We're looking again towards next year, or FY23, having K2 class sizes around 22 and 3-8 class sizes around the 24 mark. We'll continue to leverage buffer zones and monitor those as closely, or if not more closely, than we've had in the past. The other is to acknowledge that we're in the final stages of the special education program review, and that I think will come with some acknowledgements as well as recommendations. So that is not necessarily included in this particular budget, in this new modified budget that you'll see, but I do want to flag that or raise that. And then our middle school review, that process will soon be launched in understanding our middle school model, how it's the impact of the programming and the staffing also. So that's something for us to keep on the radar. And the teacher FTE savings that are projected here, we use an estimated number, or a number of $75,000 as that number. So again, the 23 preliminary budget request was $130.6 million. And looking at the list of 18 items, or the 910,000 that I recommended for supporting identified needs in the system, we're looking at putting some of those on hold. So therefore reducing or pulling back 420,000, 421,000 out of the budget request. And looking at our K-8 section adjustments, we've identified 12 sections right now that are currently in the system that we feel that can be consolidated or adjusted moving forward as we roll forward, that will still allow some capacity needs. I think it's also important, one of the considerations from the previous slide to note is that in making some adjustments, as such, some of our classes will start the year close to full, if not full, meaning that they will be, at the 21, 22 level at the beginning of the year. So we have to think very carefully about additional people that may move into the system. But we identified 12 sections, and right now we've worked to say that the specials that will accommodate that, we've identified 2 FTE in that, so that's a total of 14 FTE. And again, we used a projected $75,000 cost with those. There were some increases that we recommended for the financial services or fees, I think, and legal services, pulling that 200,000 out. So when we look at run the new number as of today, the new number is coming in at 128,948,833, and the current, again, appropriation from the town side is still at 124,817,362. And I think I'll stop sharing at this moment and take any questions that you all may have about that.
Before I call on you, Stephen, I'm gonna take a moment to ask a specific question, Linus. Can you talk a little bit about the 2 questions? One is how you'll be thinking about managing the 12. Will that be handled through attrition, or what is your vision for that? And then, or I should say the 14. And then if you could talk a little bit about, in the past, we've heard that that for basically every classroom section, there's roughly like a 0.6 FTE in other Unit A positions related to world language, art, just a blend of all the different other positions. And if you could just talk about why you have 2 FTEs as opposed to sort of a 0.6 for every classroom section that you're planning to reduce.
Yes. So first question, and thank you for raising that. And again, this will be those moments when you see people that are so down in the trenches, and you look at these things over and over, and you make us, it gets lost on you. So it's a good reminder to just make sure we try to be as transparent as possible about the thinking. So I appreciate the question. So in looking at the 12, so the thinking there is that there are a number of long-term positions, sub-positions that are out there. And that these positions can be absorbed essentially through a natural attrition process. So our goal is to have little to no impact on staffing. That's what this current number represents. We believe we'll continue to mine through our data very carefully so that we can stand solidly on those claims. As far as the FTE that are assigned with specials, this was the first cut through of that. And so we do believe that there are additional efficiencies that can be gained, but there are, as you've heard already with the enrollment report, there are many, many moving parts. And so we want to make sure that we look through all of those carefully and taking into account those numbers. So we will be doing additional pass-through. So this is the first cut of that. But we'll dig deeper in terms of what the total impact may be on the FTE aspect of it. And then I also want to make sure that we're accounting for all of those pieces as well. So this was a first pass. We can stand solidly on the numbers that we've brought forth tonight, and we will dig further to make sure that we account for the rest of the pieces there.
Thank you. Okay, Stephen, do you still have your hand up, or is it?
Well, you asked the big one of my two questions, which is how are we realizing the efficiencies? So thank you for covering that, Linus. I just have a very small question, which is you went over some of the teacher-student ratios in K-8. Did you do the same exercise with BHS?
Another great question. So what I shared earlier was that BHS numbers are essentially at their pre-pandemic status, or very close to it. And so my work with the high school has been thus far is to look for the efficiencies that can be gained. They're certainly going through their scheduling process or requesting. And so classes, what I will call as a former high school principal, sweetheart classes that may be extremely small, those sections may not be able to make. And so we want to start thinking about how do we make sure that our sections are large enough or larger so that we can make sure that we have a good experience out of it. So that's the path that we're taking right now with BHS. But there's more to come. So these efficiencies, and again, another great question, Stephen, reflect right now what we're looking at in terms of the K-8 section. We've not looked at the high school yet more deeply.
Okay, thanks very much.
We acknowledge that too, so.
No, thanks for sharing that. And I bring it up in part also because of one of the listening sessions, I think several of us were startled to hear teachers report class sizes in excess of 30 at BHS. So I'm really anxious to hear some of the results of your analysis at BHS when it's appropriate. Thanks.
Well, and again, it's and that's again a function of certainly going through the process. When does the master schedule, especially for the high school, gets built? How do we, start? And I've seen it, again, in a number of systems done many different ways. And so we have to just start thinking about all of our processes as a whole, and how and where these parts fit in so that we make sure that we have the best information as these processes roll forward.
Susan?
Good. Just let me start on that last point, and then I'll just go back to some of the presentation things. I think it might be helpful because the high school schedule is so complicated that it's a place where average class sizes are just meaningless. Like you can't even do median class sizes because the way that different kinds of classes are staffed between arts classes, between AP classes, between classes for special populations or children with special needs, like they're so different that I think when you have that conversation, it's probably worth just doing kind of a 101 on the different kinds of classes that the high school runs, because just think that it will be really illuminating for school committee members to understand why by design, we have classes that run at 30 and we have classes that run at 17, right, on purpose. And that's always been true. And I'm sure there are efficiencies to get, but I think that base level understanding is important because we have a lot of new school committee members without kids in the high school. So that'll be one thing. The second thing is that I also think just on the high school, it's a little bit different if when we have a growing a similar or growing population versus sort of a declining population. And that was actually one of the questions I wanted to ask about Erin's report, which is sometimes it's helpful to see at a macro level that we lost 1,000 students or whatever it was, but sort of understanding that by K-8 versus high school is actually important because of exactly what you just said, Linus. And I'm not sure people understand that about what the high school enrollment is at, what it was at, what it is at, what it's projected to be at, because it's just a really different set of considerations in terms of what degrees of freedom the fifth floor or this administration of the high school even have, given what's going on really differently with those populations. So it's also kind of a comment for Erin's piece of maybe trying to disaggregate that at least on one slide of where that where the losses are and where they aren't. My last question is that I think the other thing that might be helpful is to kind of hear from, not right now, but when we talk about consolidations or efficiencies at the high school, it's just to understand from not only the teachers, which we've heard for sure, as Stephen said, but also from the administrators about what the parent reactions are, because sometimes there are classes at the high school that when there aren't a sufficient number of them, when we take them out, there's significant outcries. So for example, there was a year, many years ago when there was a low enrollment in one of the Asian American studies courses. And there was an idea, if you looked at it just from an arm's length, there's an idea that maybe we should sort of ditch that as a sweetheart class, but actually, given that it was one of, and I'm not going to get the details on this right, but given that it was one of the only classes on, focused on, that particular set of curriculum, there was a tremendous sort of feedback from the community at large, not just parents, but our Asian American community at large, to not lose that class and to do what we can to actually increase enrollment in it. So at any rate, they're just really, and the same thing with if you don't have enough sections of AP fill in the blank, it kind of screws up what a number of parents want, or if you don't have enough sections of some of the CTE classes, which others groups of students need. So anyway, it's just so complicated that I would just really hope that when we have that conversation about efficiencies, that we do it in the context of the feedback that we have, and then make sure that the recommendations that because some of them we already know the kinds of reactions we're going to get from the teachers and the parents. And so kind of forewarned is forearmed on that. So anyway, that was on that high school thing. The thing I wanted to say about about the slides was just thank you. It was really helpful to kind of see this all in one place. And I don't want to kind of go through at too detailed a level, except just to reiterate Mariah's question about kind of the gross up factor for specials, particularly at K-5. I think they'll be helpful to understand. And then sort of the elephant in the room question, which is which is how are we going to get from 128.9 to 124.8, or what's going on with that 4 million? Are we thinking we still have things that we're working on to address it, or are we thinking that it just is what it is and we're going to have to deal with it? So I think it's just important to understand if we think there's more room and things you're still working on, that's important to know. And if we think that there isn't any more room, that's important to know also. So
when does
that's just my overall question. But anyway, I really appreciate this. This is a really helpful way to think about how you're thinking about the kind of efficiencies.
Susan, my only response, and this is timely, and you tell me whether it's a discussion now or maybe a week from now, is process. I respect that there's a desire for a complete, transparent process. And so to answer your question, I think you've seen the lion's share of the number coming down, and there's not going to be another $4.1 million. And so I guess I turn the question back to you. to say, how do we frame it to through subcommittee of advisory to the whole advisory to board, select board, about other resources to bring their number up, because to close this gap of now 4.1, it's going to take more of them coming up than us finding more of a way to come down. I think that's a fair statement at this point.
Other questions from members of the subcommittee or other members of school committee or advisory? Leslie, I also see you took yourself off camera. I don't know if you were planning to make a comment, but if you want to, you're welcome to. No? Okay. Stephen, I see your hands up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Susan's question to Linus about the 4 million. What your thoughts are right now about it? Are you still hopeful of finding some major efficiencies? Are you thinking that we're coming pretty close to the number that we're just going to have to ride into town? Like, where are your thoughts on this?
I think we should saddle up our horses.
I knew you were going to pick that metaphor out.
Saddle up our horses so we can ride. I think, there will be some efficiencies to be made or additional to be found, but I don't know that it will come near. And I think that's the conversation. I mean, when you're talking about 4 million now, it's not dribs and drabs. It's, those are big, wide scale swaths when you start looking for that type of number at once. And so that would then start really cutting down to the bone of our organization and operation. And so we will continue to do our parts to look for efficiencies, but I don't see $4 million worth of additional efficiencies. Whatever we can find, we will certainly acknowledge and bring forth to the committee with adjusted numbers. But I think at this point, the advocacy in terms of you leveraging the available funds through the ARPA, in terms of requesting that, I'm certainly having the conversations with Mel. He's, again, I think still in the similar boat with, I think they're at what they say on 1.2, I think of a gap of 1.2.
Yes, in that ballpark, that is correct.
So that's where it is. We'll continue doing our research and digging, but I think we're pretty close.
Thanks.
Helen?
Hi, I'm sorry I was late. I thought it was at 5, not at 4. You switched it up, right?
It's Purim tonight, so we're trying to end before sundown. Yes.
I forgot about Purim. Okay, sorry. Thank you. My question is, do we have any sense of how the House is going to end up with Chapter 70 funding?
I saw an article just prior to coming on, I think, but the plea there will certainly be for additional resources. I think the concern, and don't quote me on the numbers, but I think there was concern about the law that caps sort of the inflation rate that could be utilized in trying to work to get above that. But the House is certainly going to, the legislators are going to certainly be advocating for more.
But we don't have a number yet.
We don't have a number yet. And so Mel and I have been having conversations about that we expect there may be a slight uptick, but I don't know that it's going to be enough to bridge this gap.
Yeah, no, I never even thought it would be enough, but it would be nice if there were some to help out.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Cliff?
Thanks. I was just wondering if I could get a little clarification on something that Linus just said. Talking about Mel saying that he's got a 1.2 gap. Now, is that a gap of 1.2 versus the 4.1 or so, or 4 point whatever it is that you're at? Or I just didn't understand how that.
That's on comment. Top of, so Cliff, when we were first at 5.8, the overall town gap was 7, 1.2 on the town side and 5.8 on the
Got it.
school side. Now it would drop to 5.3, 4.1 on the school side and still 1.2 on the town.
If he hasn't found any inefficiencies, and we haven't discussed that, those were his earlier numbers, so he may have found some, but we've not seen any updates on it as of yet. So I don't want to commit Mel's numbers as such, but that's where, you know, the conversation was when we last shared it.
Okay, thank you.
Catherine. And Catherine, do you want to introduce yourself too, since you're a new member of the subcommittee and I think relatively new to advisory?
Sure. Hi, I'm Catherine Florio. I'm relatively new to advisory and relatively new to the subcommittee. Thank you, Mariah. And thank you all for this great presentation. Because I'm relatively new, I have a fairly basic question. When I'm looking at the overview, you all call LEA, Local Education Appropriation. Are you using that as a synonym for town school split?
I'm using it as a synonym, thinking of food, a synonym for town appropriation, which ultimately that's what comes out of the town school partnership. But this is town school partnership is something uniquely Brookline. LEA is an acronym throughout the state, and it ties to an appropriation from town meeting where you have towns with school districts.
And can I follow up? Is there an average state number for the town percentage, the town contribution, what you are calling LEA?
State average with in what way?
Well, I think I understood you to say that LEA is a state acronym and that's what's used for the request to the town. So I was just wondering if there's a average LEA in some format, percentage per student.
You mean as like percent of town revenues or percent of municipal revenues or something like that?
Or whatever marker or metric is used.
There's per pupil expenditure that provides, and that's something that's reported through our end of year report. Every school district reports. That is one sort of common metric. But then to Mariah's point, another metric, although it's a bit harder to get at, is what percentage of the total budget is allocated to school versus municipal departments.
So I don't know that there is one. I haven't seen one, but that's an interesting question though to look at what it may be. So I think it's worth an exploration.
Thank you. Yes, it would be interesting to have.
Thanks, Catherine, and welcome.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions from anyone who's here? Also, members of the public, if you want to make any comment, this is again a subcommittee meeting, so welcome to make a comment if you'd like to. Dave, Robin, can you promote him or however you let him speak?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Dave Gayshok, town meeting member, most recently of precinct 13, although now living in 14. And I would just encourage the subcommittee and the school committee and the administration and the AC not to think too short term here in terms of the pandemic, not to be what we might look back on as penny wise and pound foolish. I think these are not, as we all know, I think PSB educates Brookline and surrounding communities' children, and does so with dedicated professionals who can't be moved around a board to maximize efficiency year to year perfectly. And the fact that we have been dealing with a pandemic for the last few years makes the per student need more significant, and the per staff member support need more significant rather than less significant. So this is enrollment has been down due to the pandemic, but I think we have a number of reasonable bases to think that that's not the permanent state of affairs. And so continuing to keep excess capacity in the short term as a longer term play to ensure that PSB is serving all of its stakeholders as well as we all want it to, I think is a worthy goal. And if that requires more stretch, and if it requires pushing towards an override scenario that we back in 2018 thought we would be in last year anyway, I would encourage folks to be thinking in that direction rather than to be thinking about short-term cost cutting that will probably end up costing us more in the long run, both financially and in other ways. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Any other comments from school committee, subcommittee, before we move on to some other parts of the budget for now? Okay. At our meeting on February 23rd, I think it was, we had a discussion of the non-personnel costs in the budget. And there were a couple of questions. And so Sam has brought back some additional information to discuss, to follow up with the subcommittee on.
Yeah, maybe
So
I will
you're up,
share.
Sam.
I'll try to share my screen just so I have these. I think I have the sheets that are applicable. So let me do that. Okay. And then, all right, let me go to the right. So yeah, this is where I'd like to start. And so hopefully you can all see it. What this is the question came up to provide context, right? Was year over year. So again, in the non-personnel, the base year, the year we're in, non-personnel expenses of 121,066,547. Appropriation is 15,983,584. And the major categories, either by dollar amount or by magnitude of change, are listed, and there's 7 of them. Out of district tuition, transportation, both in and out of district, pre-K to 12 curricular materials, special education supplies and materials, information technology, financial assistance program, and facilities expenses. And when you add that all up, it encompasses well over 90% of the total. And the remaining is the remaining. And then when comparing that to the column next to it, the overall increase is a 5.53% increase, or 883,000 in change. And I want to go through these quickly but granularly, and certainly can answer questions at any time. The out-of-district tuition, and this is the aforementioned, and we'll get better over time of explaining all the moving parts, but this one only has 2, thankfully. The 80 out-of-district tuition placements that Steve Ehrenberg had asked about, and the cost of which is roughly $8 million projected for next year, is funded roughly 60% out of the operating budget, or this $4,852,563, and it's budgeted to be level. And nobody would believe, and that would be right, that out-of-district tuition isn't going to go up in cost. It is. However, our reimbursement under circuit breaker for high-cost special education placements, largely out of district, is going up, reimbursing out-of-district transportation from 25% to 50% for F23 under the Student Opportunity Act. And so the expectation is additional money is coming in for next year to the tune of $300,000. And so what's in the base budget for 23 that we expect to draw for circuit breaker is approximately $3,100,000, $3,124,000 to be exact. And so that with the $4,852,000 comes up to approximately $7,975,000 for the 80 placements, and any increases will be borne, which there will be, are going to be borne out of the additional funding for circuit breaker. Transportation is the next item, largely the same. It's budgeted approximately $3.1 million. The 24,460 increase is for the part that has to do with yellow buses that go around town for regular education. The lion's share of this money, and when I say lion's share, probably 2.5, 2.6 million of that 3.1 is an out-of-district transportation and special ed. And in-district special ed transportation, those are those vans that go around. And again, those will go up, and the additional circuit breaker money will cover that as well. And that's why you see a slight increase only. Pre-K to 12 curriculum materials is the next line item, and that we're going to get more granular there. So I'm going to skip that for now, but you can see the almost half of the increase of 883 is in that category. But it's broken out to two places, and it was due to ESSER, and I got more information based on the last time this was presented. So I would ask you to indulge me. Special education supplies and materials, that's $1.4 million, and that's going up 78,000 and change, or 5.76%. Those are for testing materials, instructional materials, things related to students on ed plans. Information technology is going up by $117,010. This is largely, this is the area that is under Feng Yang. And this is driven primarily by computer leases. We lease all of our technology, certainly and that's driven mostly by student use technology, whether it's MacBook Airs or Chromebooks, and also faculty and staff technology, as well as related servers, routers, access points. That is a 6.4% increase. Financial assistance, which was talked of, there was an initiative given what's been talked about at school committee and seeing some capacity in our overall budget ask for what we projected in November for town. We felt it would be worthy to put $100,000 additional placeholder. As mentioned before, this is one of the efficiencies that would be pulled back to that lower number, but at this first blush, it was in there. 175 to 275. Facilities at $1 million. That is really in two components. The major component, which was touched upon previously, was we have a hybrid model for our building cleaning, especially in the evening. We use our own employees largely during the day, and largely in the evening, we hire a company called CleanCo to do our contracted cleaning. And of that $1.1 million, approximately 700,000 of that number is the contracted cleaning. The rest of that money would be things like paper towels, cleaning solutions, things like that. Backpack vacuums, things that we would buy for our custodial staff. And then again, as is in 22, 23, it captures over 90%. Those 7 categories capture over 90% of the total, and the remaining amount are in smaller categories that drive the increases noted below. I'll stop here and answer any questions, and then I can drill further into the curricular materials, unless you want me to drill further first.
Why don't you go to the deep dive into the curriculum materials? Because I think people might have questions about that, and then we can do all questions at once.
Oh, fine. Okay, so I'm going to the extra thing. Okay, yeah, this is what I want to show you. You can see this new one. Good.
Yep.
So this is the drill down.
Sam, do you want to provide the context of last time where people were confused by the $300,000? Anyway, go ahead and provide the context.
Oh yes, and in fact, I want to highlight. I want to put some nice highlight on a couple of these things because it'll help provide even better. So when this was first presented, it was presented as, remember, if I go back to the previous slide, and I will just, okay, and highlight this because they tie back and forth. So it was an increase of $378,900, which it is. However, it's not new money for curriculum people of $378,900. The new money is $98,042. And people were like, well, what does that mean? Well, the context that was missing was this column here, which is for this fiscal year, we are relying on $5 million, $5,012,475 to be exact, of ESSER 2 and ESSER 3, or otherwise known as stimulus funds, to balance the budget. And embedded in that $5 million was this $280,858 as distributed like that for all K-8 curriculum areas. And so to really get an apples to apples comparison, what was in the operating budget, you need to add what was supported by one-time ESSER money this year and add it as part of the F23 total, and then draw a comparison of what the variance is. And so if you look at it, again, I'm going to highlight this. So if you look at, we started at $2,510,491, you add the $280,858, you get a baseline for apples to apples comparison of $2,791,349. The preliminary budget is $2,889,391, and the change, new money, is $98,042 as distributed, you know, in these lines. Now you see a lot of zeros, and you know, you see some zeros here. You see them, and you see a minus here. This ed tech and libraries, that money was redistributed because it was for workshops. $62,000 was moved into personnel. So they didn't lose any money. It was just reallocated from non-personnel to personnel.
Sam, do you mind making it a little bigger? I think it might be a little small for people to see.
Oh, sure. Hold on. Is that better?
I think so, yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. So this 61 negative is really effectively zero. It's just that difference was reallocated in a personnel line. Down here, this money was reallocated from, this had workshop money in the base budget, and that was reallocated in personnel lines, 10,000 for each of the 8 schools, K to 8. And so again, if apples to apples, that number really went up by about $18,000. It's just redistributed from non-personnel to personnel. So then the question, so maybe I'll stop here. There was one other, there's one other screen that drills even further of where we spent so far this year against the 2,791,000, because there was some concern. An area that was highlighted is, and I like Britt Stevens, let me be clear, but Britt Stevens, the concern is we're level funding Britt. How's Britt going to operate? And we can talk about how Britt's going to operate this year and next year, and how these other departments are spending so far against their allocations, unless you'd like to stop here and answer some questions or ask some.
Why don't we stop here and see if people have specific questions? I'm conscientious of the time too, and want to make sure that it's only 5:30, but time can slip away. So do you mind taking this down and people can ask any questions they have so far?
Sure thing.
Cliff, do you want to say something? Oh, Steven's hands up.
I was actually going to say, I want to hear what Cliff's reactions is. I'm not kidding.
Well, I think at least one of these questions was Cliff's.
To give that context, I need to reiterate, Sam, over the past few years, I don't think we've had anything near this level of rigor and transparency. And I think there's been a lot of questions on the town side about how we're arriving at this budget, much less how we're justifying it. So I'm really curious to know, Cliff, as a representative of someone who's going to cast a critical eye on how we're presenting this, to what extent is the work that we're doing sufficiently justifying the numbers that we're presenting in your view? And where can we put further work into determining whether we have a strong enough rationale for our costs?
Thanks, Steve.
You're just rolling out the red carpet for Cliff, aren't you?
Well, absolutely. First, let me apologize. I thought I was on mute, so that kind of sigh I had was because I was pulling back from the computer because I had a hard time really seeing everything. Look, I think that the presentation that we had a couple of weeks ago was a really good start. And this additional detail, which I do appreciate, was included in the packet, but I personally haven't had a chance to review it in great depth. Just provides additional transparency. So for everyone to be able to, understand better how things get moved around. And Steve, all I can say is I think that is always a good thing, because it eliminates people's uncertainty, and it kind of eliminates the possible perception that there's something that's being hidden. Now, having said that, I just haven't had enough time to run through this, and frankly, at some level, it's not our responsibility, and below a certain level, there's just nothing that either we as a subcommittee or frankly the entire advisory committee should really be kind of getting into. So we want to understand it from a fairly high level, and just the more detail we can get to track from one year to the next, the better. I hope that's helpful.
Can I make a little comment, a follow-up on your comment, Cliff, which is that first off, I'm grateful that you recognized, I think, the transparency that Sam has really brought to this and his team, really thinking how we can do this. The other thing that I think that the curriculum, I'm going to repeat what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, but just to say it again, to emphasize it, that there's an opportunity to bring some additional rigor around working closely with Leslie, of course, around how budget managers think about their budget and how we go year to year in terms of what is an appropriate increase and what people need, and how we make it even stronger of a transparent, open system than has already happened so far. So it's exciting to see all these little bits and pieces coming together, and big ship, it takes a while to turn, but I think this is a great start, and I'm excited to see it continue. Leslie, you want to speak?
Sure. I was just going to say, Mariah, if there's any questions from this team just about any of the requests or asks for the next fiscal year, I'm happy to review that with the group.
Can you speak to the question that Sam flagged just quickly about what if any impact you are and how you might mitigate it for, given the inflationary environment, people like Britt, for example, who have submitted a level funded budget? Should anyone in these situations find themselves like not having sufficient funds, how will we, and maybe this is a question for Sam, but between the two of you, how will we make sure that that program costs due to inflation for anyone who has in a zero funded budget, how will we be balancing that?
I mean, I'll give you my answer just philosophically. It's going to be this year, and then I'll turn it to Leslie programmatically. And it's instilling a culture of trust, which I've worked very, I haven't been here a long time, but I'm working at it. People need to trust, and I've, at least so far, I haven't given them a reason not to. I'm talking curriculum coordinators, that we're not going to pull budgets out from under them. And they need to spend their money. They need to spend their money early, because then the impact is felt the whole year. But people should buy what they need, but not buy what they don't need. And so what I'm finding so far this year is some departments have gone over, some are spot on, and some are under. And that's typical. But by now, we're in mid-March. And this will get to the question you're asking, Mariah, and it would be the same next year, okay? Because I expect the same next year. Some will overspend, some will be spot on, some will track under. And what will happen, I want a culture where if somebody's going over, first we catch it and say, you can't do this, and then they go stamp their feet and say, we really need it. And then we look at where there's opportunities, and we redistribute within curriculum budgets through Leslie's office to, after they justify it through Leslie's office, the need to let those things happen. And we're seeing, that we had a little bit of an issue with that in math this year, and we're going to do, and we're a little bit under in English language arts, and that's how we're going to balance it. And so I vision that it'd be more of the same next year. It's just keep communicating to curriculum coordinators that this is the process in order to get what you need, but have some vetting, through OTL. And Leslie, I don't know what you want to add, but.
Yeah, I would just jump in and say, we already just in the last couple of months have integrated more processes to have a good understanding of where the coordinators are with their budgets in terms of spending, need, et cetera. So even since the last subcommittee, Michelle, Gabe, and I got the coordinators together, and we just reviewed their spending to date. And so one of the things that we found out was that this is going to be, I think, going to need to be a practice that we implement regularly, because there were some learnings that we had through this process that we didn't know about prior, right? Like there were some materials that were going to be ordered in ELA, the vendor was backlogged, and so we didn't order them. And so that was good to learn that, that that content area was having that issue, so that we could talk about what needed to happen to get the materials that we needed and get them here in a reasonable time. So there are those kind of little intricacies that I think initially coming into this role I took for granted, and now know that we just have to put very clear processes in place. So every step of the way we're evaluating what's getting spent, what is it getting spent on, are we all in agreement? What are the changes that need to happen? And therefore, there could be, if someone is underspending and not needing to spend, and there's another department that needs funding, we can make those changes within our department, if that makes sense. So just having a tighter eye on this is helpful, just as I'm learning what the content areas need, and how they're dealing with their budgets.
Thanks, Leslie. That's great to hear that you're sort of bringing in that culture of communication around it too. The other thing that I'm interested in, it's just sort of flagging for the future, is I remember hearing that because of the way that the budgets are structured, for example, this is a silly example, but math buys its own paper clips, and social studies buys its own paper clips. So to what extent that sort of communication, collaboration can be helped to sort of simplify and streamline some of the purchasing too would be a great thing as well for everybody, I would imagine, because that was flagged to us last year.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Mariah. And so having these conversations have helped us to see that, where we might be able to buy, for all of the departments, but also we're seeing that in terms of working with the schools. And so a good example of that is the visual arts budget, where some of the materials around art were coming from the visual arts budget, but they weren't necessarily used for the visual arts program. We're talking about markers and crayons that just kiddos use every day in their day-to-day happenings when they're in social studies or science or whatever content area. So Donna Sartanowicz has been great, and we've been working with her and the principals to get a different system for ordering those materials so the schools get what they need.
That's great. Any other questions or comments on any of the updates that Sam provided from the non-personnel budget? First discussion, Susan, go ahead.
Just one other question. I know there was a conversation when we opened the STEM building and Helen might remember this better than I do, of needing additional custodial support and sort of whether it was or wasn't in the budget. And then similarly with 22 tap-in. So can you just review for us, Sam, sort of what the what the increase was? And I certainly know that we transferred from Old Lincoln, we transferred custodial staff over, but where did we land in terms of sort of an increase from Old Lincoln only to, transferring that to STEM and tap-in and increasing? Because I know I just want to make sure I can answer that question.
Sam, would you like me to pull up that spreadsheet so people can reference it?
Sure. Okay. I mean, the personnel one or the, yeah.
I assume that that's what you were referring to, Susan, was you wanted to go back. You were talking about the personnel bit of it, or are you talking about the supplies bit of it?
It might have I think she meant personnel, but I think according to Matt Gillis, a lot of that largely predated the 22, because some of that moved earlier, at least maybe when the dust settled, as I understood it, it was going to be 2 FTE, 1.5, I think, this year and another half next year, next year being 23. And that would be down in, as I look at all operations, yeah, 3 point, but that's
it's right here, I think, right? It's the 46, but it's actually down by 0.05 total.
But again,
that includes, that's not only high school, is it?
No, that would be district wide. And
but I had a similar question to Susan about what we had talked about last year was that we were putting, if I recall correctly, it was a 0.5 FTE in last year, a 0.5 FTE in for the current year, reflecting the half year of the building usage at the high school. That was supposed to be a 1.0 increase in custodial for the upcoming year. because of the increased square footage at the high school. And that's not reflected here,
Well, I'd have to,
which doesn't mean your numbers are wrong. It means it probably just didn't happen. So
yeah, I'd have to drill. I mean, it's certainly, I'm sorry.
I was just going to point out that if I'm reading this correctly, there were 42.43 in which fiscal year is this?
22.
So this is 22 for the town appropriation, and this is the total all funds budget.
Correct.
And then this is the proposed next year budget town allocation. This is the all in budget for next year.
And have for custodial services, the other budget that you were just showing that went up, is that where the difference might be in the cleaning?
Well, that's contracted services.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
I imagine that may address some of it. It depends on how Matt and Ed Clancy have determined to pick up the additional square footage, whether it's through our people or contracted services.
Maybe I'll just leave it as a question, but it would be good to know, because I think we made, because we made some commitments around the fact that, we know that that it's not a one-to-one from Old Lincoln to 22 Tappan plus the STEM building. So what was I guess, I mean, to some extent, it almost doesn't matter, right? The question is like, what do we need? But specifically, I think just explaining to people that yes, some of the resources or all of the resources from Old Lincoln conceptually should be transferring over, but since we still have more square footage over and above that, I just want to make sure that we're not, because I think this was a big thing that came up, which is like, this is a great new building, but can you actually like keep it clean? Can you maintain it? That sort of thing. So I just want to make sure we're not kind of under delivering on what we promised, which is kind of taking care of the buildings. And I know we're thinking about that from a Charlie perspective, but this is just more of the day-to-day. So I guess it might just be a Hal Matt question of what is allocated and what do we need? Because my sense is that it's more than this year and definitely more than what's on that chart, but I'd just be helpful to.
No, I will follow up.
Okay, great. Because, kids make a mess.
Well, that also ties to some of the conversations we had last year, Sam, before you were here, about when we were looking at that budget model of what is an appropriate, for example, there's standards for how many square foot per custodian you're supposed to have. And it's a little bit difficult to apply some of that given the mixed model, the hybrid model that we have, but still doing some of that sort of calibration of appropriate levels of staffing, also given the other conversations we've been having about maintenance and so forth. It is helpful to get some benchmarking on that. Any other questions or comments on the budget for tonight? Oh, go ahead, Helen.
I think Sam was about to show the year to date. That was the question that I had. And actually even more so, but I realized that last year's year full budget, the variance really doesn't help us because it was such an unusual year. Being hybrid half the year, we probably didn't expend our budgets in the same way as we might in a regular year. But if you could show us what the year to date was, I saw you had it on your spreadsheet there.
I have year to date in curriculum. I don't have year to date with contracted cleaning, unfortunately. So
that I assume is probably this.
Fine, then I can. Yeah, I have to share my screen. Hold on one second. Okay, there we go.
And next year, it would be great if we could have, our budgeted, our year annual, what we spent, and then our the following year's budget.
Understood. So here again, it's the first three columns are mirror images of the previous slide. What's different is here, and specifically of the 2,791,349 in total, we have through the end of February, because that's when Donna ran this, thank you, Donna, is it was $1,282,000 expended, another 370,000 encumbered. And basically the way the math works is it's this minus this minus this equals what you have left, which in this case is $1,139,000, which I'm not gonna lie, having 40%, that's about 40% left. You know, given where we are in the year, that's a little more left than normally what you would have.
Sam, is it accurate though to say that, for example, I'm just going to pick on Leslie because she's here and she's also the first row in this thing. So there's an OTL line here that has an available budget of 241,000. There's the very first one of OTL at the very top.
Right.
And but for many departments, they might choose to, for example, underspend on this because something else has come up. And so they might be looking at netting their budget at zero across the line. But just because they have an available budget here doesn't mean that it's actually available because they have overspent elsewhere, planning to offset it here, just because the FY22 total budget reflects what was loaded into. So I guess my point is that it is possible. It's possible also that people are that essentially what we really want to have happen is we want the budget that gets loaded into Munis to accurately reflect what they intend to spend, as which may not have happened this year, but would be a goal going forward. Because then, right? Okay.
Agreed, because certainly I walked in, you know, it's just I'm making a statement of fact. I walked in and the budget was already locked and loaded when I got here, to your point, Mariah. I'm sorry, Leslie, you wanted to say something.
Sure, I was just going to second what Mariah said, but then also say there's some projects and initiatives that the teams thought they would get to, but didn't because of COVID, and having some lower teacher participation in some items or some initiatives. And then also in terms of just that first line, the OTL budget, one of the things that we tried to do at the start of the school year was get all of the federal grants in good standing. And so there was quite a bit of carryover from Title 1, 2, 3, and 4, going as far back as 2020. And so we opted to use those carryover funds before these in some cases.
And I didn't mean to call you out to make you justify yourself. I was just saying that it's not that people shouldn't interpret this as they don't need the money. It means that there's a whole bunch of other stuff happening that we should talk about rather than making an assumption off the bat that wasn't the need.
I'm glad you said it, and I didn't feel called out at all.
No, it's a wise use of money. You know, and that's what we would expect from everybody.
I would second that, and it's something which, and again, this isn't unique to Brookline, but you know, it's unique to me that I'll go as far, I'll be bold as it's criminal to not fully spend grants that you apply for, that you're entitled to. And so to Leslie's point, the message has been clear, at least while I've been here, is, you know, we're not turning back any money on any grants. We're just not doing it. And so I applaud Leslie and her people to take that very seriously and utilize those funds first. And you know, that's a culture that, you know, is really starting to take hold here.
Well, that's a nice note to end on, unless someone else really wants to say anything. Sam, do you mind taking down the slides so I can see? That's okay.
Yep.
Any last comments, Linus? Anybody else? Okay, I like the thumbs up. Okay, well, thank you everybody for the conversation today. This was great, and we'll have more follow-up. We have our next finance meeting. Well, we have advisory scheduled tomorrow and another couple meetings. And there'll be other opportunities to continue to discuss at full school committee and at finance subcommittee meetings as well. So thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Too.
Bye.